In this story, God in his sovereignty brings Daniel and his three friends to a place where they have to choose whether they are going to obey God and live out a life of conviction right in the middle of their suffering, or whether they are going to disobey God and choose a life of compromise because they want to sidestep suffering. That sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Sidestepping suffering. I might write a song. Sounds like a bad country song, doesn't it? So here are Daniel and his three friends, and they are faced with a big decision. Because when the king orders Daniel and his friends to eat from the royal menu, this went against everything they believed. So they had to make a choice. Either give in to the king's request and live a life of compromise, or obey God and live out a life of conviction. Compromise, conviction. Church, we are faced with this every day in our life. Well, here's what they did. In Daniel 1:8 it says, but Daniel, and I'm going to just add his friends to this verse, but Daniel and his three friends determined that they would not defile themselves, they would not compromise themselves by eating the king's food and drinking his wine. So, here they are suffering, but they choose to put themselves in a place where they could really suffer, because if the king found out that they were refusing to eat from his royal menu, he probably would have thrown them in prison or even put them to death. So this is more serious than it sounds. But these four men were like, we're not going to compromise. And if we suffer, oh well. You see, it's really true. We can learn to suffer without compromise. And here's how. Are you ready? Unbreakable obedience to God. Say that with me. Unbreakable obedience to God. Now, do you know why this is such a big deal? Here's why. If we don't learn how to suffer without compromise, we will end up spending our lives stuck right here. And my friends, God will keep using the seasons of suffering in our life to teach us this specific lesson. And he will bring us back to this very place over and over and over again until we learn this valuable lesson of learning to suffer without compromise. And here's why. Don't miss this. If we are going to move forward in our lives, in our seasons of suffering, we have to get over this hurdle. Now, here's why this is so difficult for us. Most of us, when we suffer, we tend to make exceptions for ourselves, excuses for ourselves. We tend to lower the bar of our convictions. And we tend, and this is what scares me about the church today, we tend to give in to secular ways of thinking instead of using this eternal book as a grid by which to measure our lives. Amen. And we say things like this. Well, I really don't believe that God expects me to do that under these circumstances. And I don't believe that God really means for me to subject myself to that verse. After all, I'm suffering, and that just makes everything gray. And so we make excuses for our compromise. Come on now. We've all done it, haven't we? But here's the thing, church. God is sovereign, and his plan for us is sovereign, and that plan includes suffering, and his word is sovereign. And when we try to sidestep his activity in our life, and when we give in and compromise in our seasons of suffering, our life becomes like a broken record, and we just get stuck in a rut. And we never move forward in our life. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about this morning, because this is where you have been for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years of your life. And some of you know people who have been stuck right here for a long, long, long time. Here's the thing. Jesus said, if you love me, you will
Obey me.
obey me. Say those two words. Obey me. Jesus said that if we love him, we will obey him even in the seasons of our suffering. If we are going to become unbreakable, we need to learn to do what Daniel and his friends did. We need to obey God and not give in to compromise. We can learn to suffer without compromise, and here's how and why. And man, I hope this sets some of you free this morning. We can learn to suffer without compromise because our convictions aren't based on our circumstances, but in a covenant relationship.
Amen.
Our convictions aren't based on our circumstances. Teens, you need to understand this. Convictions aren't elastic. They don't just stretch and move wherever we want them to go. Convictions by their very nature are absolute and concrete. That's what made Daniel and his friends say no to the royal menu. God had already said no, and so it was just a given. They said no. And because they obeyed God and refused to compromise, look at what happened next, verse 9. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. The official said, hey, go ahead and live by your God convictions. Now check this out. You see, God gave them favor so that they could live by their God convictions. You see, Daniel and his three friends aren't the hero of this story. God is the hero of this story. And here's why. The convictions that Daniel and his three friends had that caused them to suffer without compromise, their convictions weren't based on their circumstances or even their own ingenuity. Their convictions were grounded in their covenant relationship with God, and this was the basis of their unbreakable obedience to him. You see, Daniel and his three friends, as we will discover in a moment, knew God by a personal experience of his presence. They knew God through a personal covenant relationship with him. And that's what enabled them to suffer without compromise. And their unbreakable obedience to God in their suffering produced in them men who had unbreakable character of conviction. Now please hear me. My friend, if you are suffering today, if you are struggling with compromise in your seasons of suffering, here's the way out. Embracing a covenant relationship with God is the key that unlocks the door to unbreakable obedience to God. Embracing a covenant relationship with God is what helps us get over the hurdle of compromise. Because convictions can't be based on our circumstances. They can only be based in a covenant relationship with God. And hear me, this is what has to drive our life in our seasons of suffering. Let me tell you what I mean by a covenant relationship. That might be a little new to some of you. And as I was studying Daniel, I kept going, well, why would they go through all of this? Well, the only reason they went through all of this is because they had a covenant relationship with God. This is a little bit heavy, but I think if you'll wrap your minds around this, it will help you so much and be a source of strength to you when you suffer. So check this out. Check out just a nutshell of covenant relationship. In Genesis 15, Abraham, the father of Judaism, the father of us all, enters into a covenant relationship with God. And here's how the exchange went. Abraham sacrificed several animals and placed them in parallel columns on the altar. God himself comes in the form of fire and passes right smack dab through the middle of these two rows. Now listen. With this act, God is obligating himself irrevocably to Abraham.